Welcome.
Shalom.
Okay, let's get started.
Okay, so we're going to be working on Daniel 4 today. And whoever thought that a tree could have anything to do with timelines, but we will. And as we look at the next slide, we'll see that we're just going to be working on a little bit of a workshop quiz here today, and we'll try to involve you a little bit. So we're going to be looking at some timelines in chapters 7, 8, and 9. And it's a little bit of a math lesson as well. So for some of you that aren't really used to math, we'll try to go a little bit slower on some of the slides. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. We know that Daniel 4, as we've already learned in the last 3 sessions, lays down the guidelines of how to work with prophetic timelines. And it doesn't matter whether they're symbolic or literal. He tells us what to do with those timelines, especially for the books like Daniel and Revelation. Excuse me. However, I just want you to know that those principles of how to work with timelines also apply to Yahushua's prophetic messianic timeline. It was the only sign that he gave to the leaders and the people that would determine that he was the true Messiah. Now, you all know what it is, 3 days and 3 nights and the rest of the verse. He said that is the only sign you're going to get. There was lots of other signs that happened before that, but he said this is the one you need to watch for because it's the one that actually pinpoints the true Messiah. Remember, there's anti-messiahs out there as well. So in Daniel 4, we looked at a little table that just kind of gives us an idea how this works. And there are tables for the other timelines as well. I'm not including them today. But the timeline is going to include the length of the timeline. And in Daniel 4, it was 7 years. And then the subject, it was about King Nebuchadnezzar. And we also give the scriptures. It was found in 4 different verses there. And then we need to know what this timeline is beginning with. Well, in Daniel 4, it was the king being driven into the field as a wild beast. Remember, he had a probation time of 1 full year. And when he got a little bit too high and haughty, doesn't it say, well, the word was in the king's mouth is where everything happened. And it was a speaking voice. It was a decree from heaven that said, now is when your timeline is going to start. You're going to be driven into the field as a wild beast for 7 times. But the timeline actually does run the full length and then it ends. And yes, indeed, King Nebuchadnezzar was delivered from his insanity. And how did it happen? By the king's speaking voice. He gave honor and praise to Yahuwah for being the creator of everything. So as we go on, excuse me here, to slide number 4, we're going to take a look at some of these timelines. Pardon me. And Daniel 7:25 is the very first chapter in Daniel's book that has a prophetic timeline that has to do with something around Yah's people. And it is called the 1260. We'll just keep going. What I wanted to say about Daniel 7, while you're looking at this picture, is that he has these symbolic beasts. And first one that was mentioned was a lion with wings, the eagle wings. There's a bear there. There's a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings of a fowl, not wings of an eagle. And then there's also this dreadful beast that has 10 horns. These are what we call symbolic beasts in Daniel 7. But there is another one that's called the little horn. And so why I have symbolic beasts and a horn up there is because the horns are going to link in to the next vision that is found in Daniel 8. So Daniel 7 is about symbolic beasts, and then it talks about a symbolic horn. So now as we look at slide number 6, we're just going to take a little bit of a peek around what's happening there in Daniel chapter 7. It tells that there's going to be a 1260-year timeline and that the little horn is going to persecute for 1260 years. This is what it says in verse 25. And he, that's the papal little horn, shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times, or the moads, and laws, and they, this is Yahuwah's saints, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of time. So this wording in red is prophetic terminology, that we have got a prophetic timeline here. But this is a symbolic timeline because it's encased with all kinds of symbols of beasts and a horn. So as we go on to slide number 7, we'll continue on with this and see where we end up. I just have a little table here about how we can understand this prophetic terminology that is actually a timeline. It says in Daniel 7, time, times, and a dividing of time. But this terminology comes up again in chapter 12 of Daniel, and also you'll see it in chapter 12 of Revelation. But it might be worded times, times, and a half a time, or times, times, and a half. But basically it all kind of sounds the same. So remember when we looked at Daniel chapter 4, and the heavenly decree was to Nebuchadnezzar that you're going to be in the field 7 times, and it was 7 years. So it's really easy. 1 time equals 1 year. So on the chart, we have the first part of the term is time. Just follow the chart. It's 1 year, and in symbolic time, it's 360 days. This is symbolic time. But if we want to understand how much it is in literal time, we have to use that day for a year computation principle. So that means that 1 day equals 1 year. So for 1 time, that is worth 360 years. When we get to the second part of times, that's 2 years. It's more than 1, it's 2 years. That equals 720 days. You do the conversion, 1 day equals 1 year. You have 720 years. And then it ends up by saying a dividing of time. Well, that's half of the time. So it's going to be 180 days instead of the 360, and that equals 180 years. So you add them all up, and you basically have 3.5 years, which would be 1,260 days in symbolic time. And when you convert it 1 day for a year, you have 1,260 years. So it's just a little bit of math. It's not very hard. So on the historical level of application, this prophetic symbolic timeline actually represents a literal 1,260-year reign of the little horn. That is the papal little horn. So what we want to know is, how does this timeline begin and end? We're going to use the principles from Daniel 4 that we're looking for speaking voices or legislative decrees or something like that. Well, in the very beginning, there has to be a speaking voice in order to start this particular timeline. And let's look and see what it's going to be. And this is just a very, very simple presentation. There's lots of history that needs to be searched out, but I'll just give you nuggets today. The Roman Emperor Justinian wrote a decretal letter way back in 533, and it didn't take effect until 538 AD, giving the popes the complete ecclesiastical and political power, seat, and great authority to rule over the whole Roman imperial kingdom. It belonged to the Caesars before that, but the kingdom was falling apart, and so Justinian said, you know what, I need some help, and he just turned the whole thing over to the popes and the bishops and said, you guys figure it out, hold this thing together. Well, that was the beginning of church and state, and church and state was never ever supposed to be united. But that was where this timeline began, way back there in 538, when that letter went into effect. And it has to run the full 1,260 years, and indeed it did. And then there has to be a voice or something to tell you that it ends. And the ending speaking voice is like this. Berthier, through his governor or officer, Napoleon, entered into Rome in February of 1798. In fact, they say it was the 10th of February. And he proclaimed a republic, and he removed Pope Pius VI from his Vatican seat in Rome and took him back to France and put him into exile. So there was no pope reigning on the throne over that Roman kingdom anymore. And as far as everybody in Europe was concerned, they were so happy because they declared that the papacy was dead. Well, yes, something was dead. The only thing that was dead was the Little Horn Kingdom, because there's another Roman kingdom that is rising up immediately right after. But that was the ending of the Little Horn Kingdom. So let's go a little bit further. That's how the 1260-year timeline works. Just a nugget. Well, the question is, after Daniel 7:25, then what? We just read the verse. Well, after the 1260 years are over, and that was in 1798, verse 26 actually declares that it is time for this little horn system to come under judgment. Now I'm saying this system because there's more. The little horn is gone. It's over with. I know a lot of people still talk about the little horn. Sorry, that system, that time frame of that kingdom is gone. We're going on to another Roman kingdom after that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's a judgment. It's a judgment. And it's very, very interesting because we're going to end up looking into Daniel 8 about something about a judgment. So I've just picked out a couple of verses here. And really, judgment should be a full study on its own. But just let me give you a couple of verses. In Revelation 14:7, it says, "Fear Yahuwah and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come." Well, who's getting judged? Is it Yah's people or is it the beast? That is an important thing to understand as well. In Daniel 7:26, the very verse following this timeline, it says, "But the judgment shall sit." Who is getting judged? In John 5:22, it tells us that the Father has committed all judgment onto the Son. So we know that there's somebody judging, and it's the Son. And then in 1 Peter 4:17, it says, "For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of Elohim." That's interesting. But don't forget, the beast has to be judged as well. In Romans 14:10, it also says, "For we all shall stand before the judgment seat of Christ." And Daniel 7:27, eventually, in this verse, the kingdom and the dominion is going to be given back to Yah's people, the people that are the saints of the Most High. So when the judgment is finished, and basically everyone, this is a very stern judgment against the beast. When that judgment is done, then dominion and power will come back to Yah's people. So there is judgment on both sides, but it's more towards the beast than it is to Yah's people. Let's look at slide 10 as we think about this judgment. Because now we're going to pop into Daniel 8:14. This particular verse has a number of 2,300, 2,300 days. And this particular timeline has something to do with judgment that we had seen in Daniel chapter 7. So let's delve into the next slides about Daniel 8:14. And I had to do a little bit of extra work here to sort of pull it together for everyone. It's just very, very basic. Can we advance the slide, please? Thank you. In Daniel 8, it is another chapter with symbols, but this time we're carrying over the symbols of the horns. Remember, we had the little horn in chapter 7. That was our jumping point to come into what's happening in Daniel 8. We have the ram with his horns, and these are sanctuary sacrificial animals. We have a ram with his horns. Then we have the goat with a notable horn. We also have the little horn. We are following the outline of the kingdoms of the Medo-Persia, Greece, and little horn papal Rome. Babylon is off the scene by this time. Babylon is not part of this prophecy. It's already passed by. But there's something else that comes up. Could you advance it to the next animation? There we go. This chapter is going to take us from the symbolic horns and now move us into a king. And Daniel's fourth vision is going to talk about kings of the north and kings of the south. So we have some connection here. Between Daniel 7, we have beasts and a horn, a little horn. In Daniel 8, we have symbolic horns and a king. And then this is going to take us into the fourth vision, which is all about kings, and they're literal kings. Now, the interesting thing about chapter 8 is that this king in the heavenly scene is not called the king of fierce countenance. That's his literal title when you actually have the interpretation. But in Daniel 8's heavenly scene portion, he's called a power that waxed exceeding great. What does that mean? Waxed exceedingly greater than the little horn kingdom that was beforehand. Now, the little horn, remember, ends in 1798. This one, the waxed exceeding great, this is the waxed exceeding great, is going to come up right after that little horn, after 1798. Now, the interesting thing about this is that he doesn't come up so that you can really see him and find out what he's doing. This is where the secret society information enters in, and this papal Roman system starts to lead, but he's under the table. You can't really figure out where he is and what he's doing. And so, of course, because there's no pope that's really ruling, and eventually they did have Pope Pius VII come along and take this seat after Pope Pius VI passed away. Then Pope Pius VII was all ready to go. He represents this system of the king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences. So we have something really interesting here happening with this system as well. Now, like I said, you look back and you don't really see him unless you're looking at the secret society information. This is the system that we are under today. It's been rising and rising and rising. We are now basically in this new world order, okay, moving towards the last king of the north that you're going to find in Daniel 11 in those last 5 verses, moving forward to the king of the north that will be basically including your one world religious government. So there's some timelines that come into play here in Daniel 8 that have to do with this system. Not only that, they have to do with Yah's people that are in the world during this system. This is since 1798. It says in Daniel 8 that there's going to be a timeline of 2,300 days. And he said, this is Daniel 8:14, and he said, this is the saint from verse 13. And the saint from verse 13 said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And we all know about a sanctuary. We've heard about Day of Atonement in the wilderness and in Solomon's temple and all these sanctuaries. We know that that was a building. That was a building where people went to worship and they had their sacrifices. We know about that sanctuary. But I have to ask the question here, what sanctuary is this verse talking about? It says, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And I just want to make it very clear here that I don't have it as clear in the Daniel book as what I want to show you today. But this is also a prophetic, symbolic timeline, because this vision is containing symbols of horns, and then it has that symbolic title of waxed exceeding great. And that gets interpreted by Gabriel as the papal Roman king of fierce countenance. And he follows the little horn power. Gabriel gives him a title of the king of fierce countenance. That's a literal title. But this is the Roman kingdom that is coming up after the little horn. So let's go on to slide 13. Let's try to understand this 2,300 days and how it would calculate out in a literal timeline. Well, 2,300 days is a symbolic term and it's in words. But when you put it into numerals, you simply have 2,300. In symbolic time, this is 2,300 days. And if we're going to get literal time out of it, we just use 1 day equals 1 year. You just do the rule, 1 day equals 1 year, and it equals 2,300 years. So it's a very long timeline. Basically, I would say it's the longest timeline in the whole scriptures. So don't forget that we're talking about Daniel on the historical level, not a future end time level, historical level of application. So this symbolic timeline is now is including something to do with that 1260-year reign of the little horn, because it ends in 1798, and then the time frame of this rising papal king of fierce countenance. So the question is, just when did this 2,300-year timeline begin and end? Let's take a look at that on the next slide. And I know there's a lot of controversy over this particular timeline, but just hear me out and you can all make a decision on your own. But first of all, there's two questions that we need to ponder about the information that we've just read in Daniel 8:14. Which sanctuary needs to have cleansing? Is it a building or is it his people? Which one needs to be cleansed? Which one is Daniel 8:13 and 14 actually talking about? And another question here is, what does the cleansing of a heavenly sanctuary, way up there, have to do with prophetic events that are happening around Yahuwah's people down here on the earth, down here in Daniel 8? When you're looking at Daniel 8, he's going along and he's telling you all about the ram and the he-goat, tells you about the little horn, the Roman little horn, tells you that the Roman little horn came out of imperial Rome, and then it tells you about that waxed exceeding great kingdom that's going to come along. Everything is happening on this earth. I have a lot of people that like to tell me that in verses 13 and 14, that now all the events that Daniel's talking about have gone all the way up to heaven, and there's two verses talking about a sanctuary in heaven that has to be cleansed, and then we come back down to finish all of the events that Gabriel gives for the interpretation of the vision. I'm here to tell you that I do not agree with that. Daniel does not give us permission to take the events of whatever he's talking about of these kingdoms away from the earth, zoom up to heaven, give another interpretation, and then come back down. So, what needs to be cleansed? Is it a building or is it a people? Let's continue on and see if we can find out. The full context of Daniel 8 is about kingdoms. It's all about kingdoms on this earth. The ram with the horns, the goat with the notable horn, that beast papal little horn kingdom, and then this waxed exceedingly great that has got the title of King of Fierce Countenance. All of these kingdoms rule on the earth. In fact, all of the events in Daniel's third vision surround these pagan kingdoms of this world and are surrounding Yah's people on this earth. Yah's people aren't up in heaven. Daniel does not randomly use one or two verses to describe a separate heavenly event when there's so much happening around Yah's people on this earth. He doesn't do that, and he doesn't give anybody permission to do that. So let's just keep going. Once again, Daniel 8:12 to 13. And a host, if you look up the word host, it's peoples, and a host of peoples was given unto him, the King of Fierce Countenance. And it, this King of Fierce Countenance, cast down all the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. When you look up the word host in the Strong's, it has different definitions. One is a mass of persons or an army or soldiers. But this mass of persons could be Yah's people as well. Let's read verse 13. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spoke, How long shall the sanctuary and the host be trodden under foot? Now I know lots of people have been taught that this is Yah's sanctuary, his heavenly sanctuary, that has been trodden on by this papal system and stomping it into the ground. And yes, they do. They stomp all truth into the ground. But there's something else happening here. When you look up the word sanctuary, it says, first of all, a sacred place or thing. It says rarely abstract, consecrated, something that's consecrated and dedicated and holy. And then do you see the word saint? Yes, saint can also be called a sanctuary. We are the sanctuary of Yah down here on this earth. We are his saints. We are his people that want to be Kodesh and holy and work for him. So let's read it again. How long shall the sanctuary of Yah's people, which the host has been trotting under his feet, how long is this going to go on? What is going to happen? Still looking at the full context of Daniel 8 and this sanctuary, because Daniel is declaring that there is a sanctuary that has to be cleansed after the 2300 days. The cleansing process begins for Yahuwah's sanctuary of saints when that 2300 days has ended. Okay, we're going to bump into this timeline and see if we can figure this out. So that's what I see happening here, is that the little horn is gone, the king of fierce countenance is rising up, and is going to take its place among these pagan kingdoms. And it's during this time frame of this king of fierce countenance that Yah is saying, I need to cleanse a sanctuary. I need to cleanse my sanctuary on this earth. Don't forget that the judgment shall sit after the little horn is uprooted. That's what it says in Daniel 7:26. After the little horn is uprooted, there's going to be a judgment that sits. Don't forget that all judgment is committed onto the Son. In fact, Yahusha tells us that himself in red words in the Gospels. And Revelation 14:7 says that there is an hour coming where his judgment is going to come as well. Judgment against the beast. We're looking at a whole time frame. We're not looking at just one single day. We're looking at a time frame where there's judging and cleansing. So I say that when the 2300-day years end, then judgment has to begin at the house of Elohim. He has to begin the cleansing process because he needs to find a bride that's going to give the last day message. Up to this point, remember everybody, the 1260 years was a time of terrible persecution. The Inquisition, so many people lost their lives in many, many different ways. Yah's people were absolutely worn out. They didn't have the scriptures. It was after 1798 that, when things started to get freed up a little bit, that Bible societies started to spring up. I think I already told you this. And people were able to afford to have Bibles, or Bibles were given to them so that they could have a Bible and read it for themselves. This was a really great time. It was called, in my denomination, a time of the Great Advent Awakening. It wasn't just about one denomination. This is about many, many different denominations that were coming together. They had their Bibles and they started studying. And what did they find? They found the truth of the second coming of Yahusha. They didn't really know it as a large group of people at that time. But when they found this truth, they were just so, so happy. And there was a very large movement. Out of this large movement, all the way around the world, Yah says, I need to find a people. I need to find a people among my sanctuary on the earth that hold these truths, that can be cleansed so that they can give my message to the world. So here we go. People that are having a cleansing. Let's look at the next slide. We want to understand this 2300-year timeline. Once Yahuwah's people were released from their 70-year captivity, when they were in Babylon, it was Artaxerxes, who was the king of Medo-Persia. He issued a decree to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, the wall, and the temple. so that Yah's people could worship their Elohim. He wanted them to return to their land and to worship their Elohim the way that they were instructed to do by him. So he issued a decree, and this decree is connected to Yahuwah's sanctuary on earth, his literal sanctuary on this earth. And that decree took effect in 457 BC, and it extends all the way to 1844 when you do the math. So if you start with 457 BC and you add in 2,300 years, because that's how long the timeline is, you will get to 1844. But you have to remember to add in the 0 year, because if you take 457 BC and you just add in 1844, it only gets to 1843. You have to make an allowance of 1 year so that you can take care of that 0 year. There's no 0 year. So anyway, Artaxerxes starts out in 457. That is the beginning voice for our 2,300 year timeline. Let's go to slide 20. At the end of the 2,300 year timeline, something else happens. Yahuwah now has a symbolic sanctuary on this earth, and it needs to be cleansed as well. This is not a literal sanctuary on this earth, it's a symbolic one. It's a sanctuary of his people. And like I said, it's in the time frame after 1798, in this first 50 years of the 1800s, where Yahuwah selected a wide group of people to be part of this cleansing process and to restore truth to all the way to the end of the time. All truths were to be restored. Well, we know it didn't happen just like that. In fact, we're still in that restoration. So what is the beginning voice? I've already told you. Let's bring it up. The beginning voice for this 2,300 year timeline is Artaxerxes' decree. When he has that decree, remember, to rebuild the city, the wall, and the temple, and that decree took effect in 457 BC as far as we understand. But it runs for 2,300 years, and then it has to end. That timeline has to end. So what is the speaking voice for this ending timeline, ending of the timeline? It's Yahuwah's voice from the heavenly courts, approximately in 1844, that is proclaiming judgment is going to begin. This is where he starts his judgment on the beast, while he is beginning to cleanse his people so that they can give the truth and be his bride. This judgment is against the beast. Now don't forget, this beast is rising and still rising today, getting very, very powerful. And at the very same time, Yahuwah is getting a people ready. He is cleansing them. There's a lot of things that they have to learn. So let's go on to slide 21. And we'll look into Daniel 9. Now Daniel 9 is going to carry over from the 2,300. We've just had a little bit of work on the 2,300, but in Daniel 9 there's a lot of timelines that are given in response to Daniel's prayer. He just felt that they needed to be released from bondage very, very quickly, and in his prayer, the angel Gabriel comes along and gives him a whole bunch of instruction about a whole bunch of timelines. Let's take a look at them. I'm just going to read them, and I've highlighted these timelines in red, but let's read the full context from Daniel 9, verses 23 to 27. At the beginning of thy supplications, Gabriel is saying, when you were starting to pray, Daniel, the commandment came forth that I am supposed to come and show you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. Well, what vision? He hadn't had any other vision except for Daniel 8, and that was quite a long time ago. And Gabriel says, I'm coming to help you to understand that vision. And here we go in verse 24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. That's a whole big study there. Verse 25. Now he's going to give him some instructions. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, that was Artaxerxes' decree in 457. He's telling him about that decree that's coming. From the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So he's saying from the time that that decree is given, there's going to be a certain amount of time until you'll get to the Messiah. And he says, the street shall be built again, the wall, even in troublesome times. And then verse 26, then he says, and after the 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, not for himself. So Messiah is going to be cut off. Basically, that's his death. And the people of the prince shall come and shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and thereof, the end thereof shall be with a flood, and on to the end of the war desolations are determined. Verse 27, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And then he says, in the midst of that 1 week, that would be half a week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So we're just going to pick out the timelines here and just go through them, most of them, and try to find these speaking voices that start the timelines, and what is the speaking voice or decree that ends the timeline. So let's get started on slide 23. And I'll take a little bit of time with this slide because for some of you it might be new information. So I've put down these timelines, and you can see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them that I've picked out. And the one that has the light gray writing, I'm not going to be doing that one in this presentation, but I'll just list it. So let's start with the first one. The first one, it says 70 weeks. That's the symbolic term in words. When you put 70 weeks into numbers, it's 7 times 70 equals 490. That is 490 days. If you have 70 weeks times 7 days per week, you're going to end up with 490 days. And in order to understand how long it is in literal time, you just use the 1 day equals 1 year computation principle. So 490 days equals 490 years. The next one that he gave was 7 weeks. Well, 7 weeks times 7 days in a week, that would equal 49 is the number. 7 weeks is the same as 49. 49 days, though, we're talking about symbolism. Remember, this is going all the way back to Vision 8, Daniel 8, that had all those horns and that king, okay? So we're talking about symbolism here. And that 49 days, when you put it into literal time, it's easy. It's 49 years. I'm just going to give the 62 weeks just so you can see it there for our math calculations. A score equals 20 years. So that would be 3 times 20 is 60. So 60 years plus 2, that would be 62 years. 62 weeks, I mean, not years, 62 weeks. And then you have to multiply 62 weeks times 7, and you'll get 434 days. These are symbolic days, and that translates into 434 literal years. The next one is adding to it. It's 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So now we're going to add in our 7 days times 1 week, so that's 7, okay? And we're going to add in our 60 plus 2 is 62, and we'll add them both together. We end up, when you add up 49 days and 434 days, you have 483, and that translates to 483 years. Looks like I might have had a goof there, but anyway, we'll fix it up later. Then the next one is 1 week. It happens to be the last week of the prophecy, the 70th week. 1 times 7 equals 7 days. 1 week of 7 days is only 7 days. That translates into 7 literal years. And then the last one is the midst of the last week. You just divide it in half, divide 7 by 2. You have 3.5. Turns out to be 3.5 years. There's a little bit more on this slide. Can we have it, please? All of these timelines are connected to Daniel 8:14's timeline of 2,300 days or years for the purpose of pinpointing 3 special things. They pinpoint the exact timing that begins Yahushua's ministry. They also pinpoint the exact timing of Yahushua's death. And they also pinpoint the exact timing of when judgment would come against that corrupt leadership with the stoning of Stephen. The Aaronic leadership are no longer going to be witnesses for Yahuwah. It was like you're not very good witnesses for Yahuwah if they're stoning his missionaries, are they? Let's look at slide number 24. And we'll go through some of these timelines. Let's look at the 70 weeks first. 70 symbolic weeks is equal to 490 years. Remember what it said? Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon the holy city. Can you give us the speaking voice there, who's ever managing the slides? There's our beginning speaking voice. We've already had it. Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild the city there in 457. And I've just given a little chart. It's not to scale, okay? So if you take 457 and you add in these 70 weeks or 490 days, it will get you all the way to 34 AD. That is a total of 490 years. So what's the ending speaking voice that stops this timeline? Well, in Acts 7:57, actually you should read the whole chapter of Acts 7. It is the voice of the Jewish leaders in 34 AD. They cried out to stone Stephen and to silence him forever. And that was the end of the 490-year timeline, or the 70 weeks that were symbolic time. That was where they were cut off. That's what the timeline said. They're going to be cut off, and it was at the stoning of Stephen. Okay, let's go to the next timeline. The next one is going to be 7 symbolic weeks, or 49 literal years, that they have to rebuild the city wall from Artaxerxes. And you can bring up that speaking voice. We should all know it by now, that it's Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild the city in 457. Now, before anything is advanced, I want you to think about what could be the ending speaking voice for this 49 years. It's to rebuild this wall in the city, to rebuild the wall. If you add 49 years to 457 BC, you will come to 408 BC. Does anybody have any idea what the speaking voice is going to be to end this timeline, so that you know the timeline is ended? Anybody? No? Okay, let's show you what it is. This is a tricky one to find. The ending speaking voice for this timeline is found in Nehemiah 12:27. It says, "And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites," this is Yah's people, "they sought the Levites to keep the dedication with gladness." Look, everyone, with thanksgiving and with singing. So their voices were dedicating this wall. That was the end of the 49 years. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Let's look at the 69 weeks. 69 weeks is a literal 434 years. And once again, we know that the speaking voice is coming from Artaxerxes. It tells us in Daniel 9:25, from the going forth of the commandment, or the decree to restore and to build Jerusalem. So we just make the application for the beginning voice of the 69 weeks. You should all know this by now. In the year 457, Artaxerxes issued a third decree by his legislative voice to rebuild Jerusalem. And that was carried out by Ezra. He did a lot to get that going. And the 69 weeks began with the very same event as the 7 weeks. Let's bring up the rest of the slide. The ending voice to end the 69 weeks, we find it in Acts 10:38, where Yahuwah is anointed Yahusha of Nazareth with the Ruach and with power. In Matthew 3:16-17, it says, and Yahusha, when he was baptized, the heavens were opened up unto him, and lo, a voice from heaven, saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So the application for this ending voice of the 69 symbolic weeks, or it's a whole 434 literal years, it's Yah's voice that proclaimed this very great event when Yahusha was anointed with his baptism. And the date, we are going to announce that with the Passion Study. We're not giving that to you today, but it starts with Artaxerxes and it ends with Yahuwah's voice at the baptism. Okay, slide 27. Let's look at this 1 week, or it's the 70th week. It's the last week of this large timeline, this large whole string of timelines. The beginning of the 70th week, we just found out, is the Savior's baptism. And we already had the speaking voice, but let's bring it up again. The beginning speaking voice for this last week. In Matthew 3:16-17, and Yahusha was baptized. He saw the Spirit of Elohim descending like a dove, and lo, a voice saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Let's advance it one more time. And like I said, the date, we will announce it with the Passion Study when we get to it. But this week also has to end, and we've already done it. It's the stoning of Stephen, and there is an ending speaking voice for this timeline. Let's bring it up. We know it is the leaders that cried out with a loud voice, and they stoned Stephen, not only by their words, but by their actions. And this is approximately 34 AD. This is when this huge, huge timeline ends from Daniel 9 with all those other little timelines. Let's go to slide 28. Daniel 9 also has another timeline that says in the middle of the 70th week. This is the middle of the last 7 years of the 490-year timeline. We already know that the beginning of this week started with his baptism. We've already read that. And the ending of it was with Stephen when he was stoned. But in the very middle of this last week, something else happens. Can we advance the slide? That's where we have Yahusha's death, his Passover. This was the very middle of the 70th week. And the speaking voice, I'm not going to give it to you. I want you to think, what is it and where is the scripture to tell you what it is? The Daniel 9 timelines and this gospel timeline of 3 days and 3 nights actually do work together, because the principles that Daniel has given to us in chapter 4, and he has showed us how they work in chapter 7, 8, and 9 with those symbolic timelines, he also shows us how to work with this 3 days and 3 nights. Can we advance the slide, please? The question is, what could Artaxerxes' decree have to do with the most important messianic timeline of the scriptures? What does it have to do with that? One more advance, please. Another question. What does Daniel 4 have to do with calculating and understanding how to begin and end Yahusha's timeline of 3 days and 3 nights? Let's look at the next statement. In the Gospels, is there another timeline similar to 3 days and 3 nights? Is there something else that we need to consider as well? And one more question, or one more statement. All this and more, we hope to reveal it in the Passion Study. So this has been a little study on our little workshop on how to work with timelines. As we work up to the Passion Study, we'll probably review this information when we get there. But if we work with Daniel and exactly the instructions he has given us on how to work with timelines, we should be able to figure out this really important timeline of 3 days and 3 nights without any trouble at all. That's basically the end, everyone. And I just hope that all of your timeline studies are abundantly blessed as you apply the principles from Daniel. Thank you very much for joining us. That is the end. And if you have any questions, you can email me at Charlene at Study the Calendar. I can give you a lot of answers, but when it comes to the Passion Study answers, we'll just have to wait till we get them done. So thank you, everyone. That's all there is for today.
I look forward to it. I do.